October 27th, 1962. 1700 hours. 200 feet below the placid surface of the Sargasso Sea, a ghost is being hunted. The Soviet submarine B-59, a diesel-electric vessel of the Foxtrot class, has been submerged for 22 agonizing hours. For a craft of its kind, designed to surface and breathe, this is an eternity. Her diesel engines are silent, unable to recharge the failing batteries that power every system, from propulsion to the very air her crew must breathe. Inside the 300-foot steel hull, the world has become a sweltering metallic crucible. Hours ago, the air conditioning gave out. The temperature has steadily climbed to a punishing 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide, the silent poison of every submerged vessel, is approaching lethal concentrations. Men, stripped to the waist and glistening with sweat, slump at their stations, some fainting from the heat and oxygen deprivation. The cramped interior reeks of diesel, unwashed bodies, and a thick, palpable fear. In the control room, Captain Second-Rank Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky stands as a statue of strained composure, his uniform soaked through. He watches his crew fight a losing battle against their own environment, their shallow gasps echoing in the stale, recycled air. And from the world above comes a relentless, terrifying percussion. For the last 4 hours, American destroyers have been tracking them, dropping small, signaling depth charges. These are not designed to breach the hull, but to hammer on it, a violent, concussive demand to surface and be identified. Each explosion is a physical blow, a shockwave that reverberates the most seasoned crew. The Americans above are playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse, entirely unaware of the true nature of their prey. They cannot know the apocalyptic secret cradled in the forward torpedo room of B-59. Nestled among the conventional weapons is a single, special torpedo. Its official designation is prosaic, but its purpose is anything but. It is armed with a 10-kiloton nuclear warhead, a destructive force equal to the atomic bomb that leveled Hiroshima. A single command could vaporize the entire American fleet in a 2-mile radius, boiling the sea and poisoning the ocean with lethal radiation for decades. Captain Savitsky holds an almost unimaginable authority. Before his mission began, he was given explicit orders from Naval Command. If attacked, if communications with Moscow were severed, if he believed war had already begun, the decision to launch was his alone. In the suffocating darkness, pushed to the very edge of human endurance, one man, isolated from the world, held the fate of millions in his hands. The line between a localized naval incident and global thermonuclear war had become terrifyingly thin, drawn not in the war rooms of superpowers, but in the tormented mind of a single commander, trapped in the crushing depths of the sea. The sound is a deep, concussive blow, a hammer fist against the hull. It reverberates through the cramped compartments of the Soviet submarine B-59, a physical shock that travels through the steel plates into the bones of the men inside. They are deep beneath the waves of the Sargasso Sea, hunted, blind, and utterly alone. For Captain Valentin Savitsky, each explosion is another piece of evidence confirming his darkest fear. The war has started. The final, terrible war. And in his hands, he holds the power to answer in kind. The order has been given from on high. Should war begin, he may use the special weapon at his discretion. The discretion of one man. That is the fragile thread from which the world now hangs. Above, the destroyers of the united them. They believe they are signaling, using small, harmless practice depth charges to force the submarine to the surface. But down in the crushing darkness, there is no way to know this. An explosion is an explosion. A practice charge sounds indistinguishable from a warhead designed to crack the pressure hull and send this steel coffin and its crew to the bottom of the ocean. For 36 hours, there has been only silence from Moscow. 36 hours since B-59 submerged to evade the American anti-submarine forces, cutting itself off from the world. In that silence, paranoia has taken root and grown into a terrible certainty. For Savitsky and his men, the world they left behind may already be a radioactive cinder. But the submarine B-59 is different from the others in its flotilla, B-4 and B-36. It is different in one critical way, a bureaucratic anomaly that even Captain Savitsky, in his escalating distress, does not fully comprehend. On board this vessel is Commodore Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, the flotilla commander himself. His presence is a simple twist of fate. He had chosen this specific submarine for the deployment to Cuba because he knew and trusted its captain. That simple, personal choice has inadvertently created an unprecedented command structure. The launch. B-59 requires the unanimous agreement of 3 senior officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. 3 men, 3 votes. A single veto is all that stands between a desperate order and nuclear Armageddon. At 1700 hours on October 27, 1962, this command structure is the furthest thing from Savitsky's mind. His reality is a suffocating, superheated hell. The air conditioning has failed. The temperature inside the submarine has soared to a blistering 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat slicks every surface, dripping from pipes, from gauges, and from the faces of the exhausted crew. Worse than the heat is the air itself. Carbon dioxide levels are approaching 2%, a toxic soup that poisons the mind. At these concentrations, human reason begins to fray. Judgment deteriorates, paranoia blossoms, and the brain, starved of clean oxygen, begins to malfunction. Men see shadows in the corners of their eyes. Headaches split their skulls. Breathing becomes a conscious, labored effort. Savitsky feels it himself. His heart pounds against his ribs, his uniform is drenched, his thoughts spiraling into a vortex of desperation with each passing hour. And still, the explosions continue. A relentless metallic heartbeat from a world that wants him dead. Boom! The whole submarine shudders. Boom! A gauge rattles in its housing. Boom! A sailor loses his footing and slams against a bulkhead. The relentless assault is breaking his men, and it is breaking him. In the torpedo room, men brace themselves against the racks, their knuckles white. In the engine room, the batteries are dying, and with them, the last of the clean air. In the dim red light of the control room, Captain Savitsky stares at the depth gauge, his face a mask of grim resolve. The explosions from above are not signals. They are an attack. The Americans are trying to destroy him. The war is on. His duty is clear. The order, when it comes, is quiet, almost lost in the hum of the machinery and the ragged breathing of the crew. But it is absolute. He turns to his officers. The time has come to prepare torpedo number 1, to prepare the special weapon. In that toxic atmosphere, a single command sets in motion the final act. But it must first pass through the crucible of 3 minds, each warped by heat, fear, and exhaustion. It is a decision that will not be made in the sanitized halls of the Kremlin or the White House, but here, in a submerged metal tube where the very air conspires against sanity. History, in its gravest moments, so often turns not on the actions of presidents or premiers, but on the quiet courage of those who, in the heart of the storm, find the strength to say no. The fate of millions now rests on whether such a voice can be heard above the thunder of the depth charges and the frantic beating of a captain's heart. 4 words hang in the suffocating air of the control room, carrying the weight of an apocalypse. The political officer, Ivan Simonovich Maslenikov, fixes his gaze on Captain Valentin Savitsky. His expression is a stark mixture of shock and grim understanding. This moment, this terrible possibility, had been a subject of hushed discussion in the long, silent days beneath the waves. Soviet doctrine was an unforgiving scripture. If war had begun, they were to fight. They were to unleash every weapon at their disposal, to strike a mortal blow against the American fleet before their own vessel, the B-59, was crushed in the depths. Maslenikov gives a slow, deliberate nod. The movement is almost imperceptible in the dim red light, but it seals a pact. I concur with the captain's order. The command travels forward, a ghost of electricity and intent. In the forward torpedo room, a space already cramped with machinery and men, the weapons officer receives the directive. He begins the arming sequence for the special weapon, the torpedo with a 10-kiloton nuclear heart. It is not a simple act, not the flick of a switch. It is a meticulous, unholy ritual. Safety interlocks, designed to cage the atom's fury, must be manually disabled. The fissionable core must be brought to a state of critical readiness. Around this core, a precise lattice of conventional explosive lenses must be wired to their electrical detonators. The entire procedure consumes time, perhaps 15 agonizing minutes from the initial order to full combat readiness. But once complete, the weapon would be unstoppable. Launched from its tube, it would detonate on contact with an American hull, or at a preset depth, boiling the sea and vaporizing steel in a flash of man-made sun. Word spreads through the claustrophobic confines of the submarine, not in shouts, but in whispers and furtive glances that carry more weight than any command. The special weapon is being prepared. Captain Savitsky intends to use it. The crew, a collection of men already pushed to the brink, fractures in their reaction. For some, a grim determination sets in. If this is war, then they will fight as the motherland expects. Others are seized by a primal terror, understanding with chilling clarity that the launch of a nuclear torpedo would instantly transform the B-59 from a hunter into the world's most urgent target, guaranteeing their immediate and violent annihilation. And a few, too debilitated by the searing heat and the insidious creep of carbon dioxide poisoning, are beyond caring. Their world has shrunk to the desperate, rasping struggle for the next breath in an atmosphere growing more toxic by the minute. Above them, on the sun-drenched surface of the Caribbean, the American destroyer USS Beale maintains its relentless sonar contact. The pinging is a hammer blow against the submarine's hull, a constant, unnerving reminder of their discovery. The USS Coney and the USS Murray move in concert, executing a coordinated anti-submarine prosecution pattern, a deadly geometric dance on the waves. The American commanders have no idea what they are truly cornering. United States intelligence has failed to detect that the Soviet submarines deployed to Cuban waters carry tactical nuclear arms. The depth charges they are dropping are small, practice-grade explosives. They are meant as harassment, not aggression, a form of coercive signaling designed to force the Soviet boat to surface and identify itself, to de-escalate the crisis without firing a shot in anger. But in the dark, pressurized hell of the B-59, the distinction between harassment and attack has evaporated. The percussive blasts rattling the hull are not signals. They are assassination attempts. For men trapped in a dying submarine, convinced that the Third World War has already begun, the American actions are the prelude to their own destruction. Context is everything. Perception becomes reality. And Captain Savitsky's perception, warped by a toxic cocktail of carbon dioxide, extreme heat, and the profound isolation of the deep, is that the Americans are trying to sink him. Moscow's deafening silence is not a technical failure. It is a tombstone, proof that the Soviet Union is already burning. At 12 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, the hatch to the control room swings open. Vasily Arkhipov enters. As flotilla commander, he is Savitsky's equal in rank, but he carries a broader strategic perspective. He has just come from the engineering compartment, discussing the dwindling battery reserves and the submarine's rapidly deteriorating condition with the chief engineer. Arkhipov is as exhausted as any man aboard, his uniform soaked through, his face etched with fatigue. But as he steps into the tense tableau of the control room, he is stepping into a sealed world on the verge of ending all worlds. Here, in the crushing depths, history balances on the frayed nerves of men who cannot speak to their superiors, who cannot see the sky, who know only the concussions of explosions and the foul taste of their own recycled air. The grand strategies of Moscow and Washington are meaningless. All that matters is the conviction of a single commander that the end has already come, and the terrible, logical imperative to strike back. The fate of millions rests not on policy, but on the desperate calculus of a few men in a steel tomb, adrift in a sea of misunderstanding. The air is a toxic soup of carbon dioxide and fear, thick with the metallic tang of overworked machinery and the salt of human sweat. Deep beneath the waves of the Sargasso Sea, the Soviet submarine B-59 is a pressure cooker, a steel coffin groaning under the percussive blows from above. For hours, the concussive thuds of American depth charges have rattled the hull and the nerves of every man inside. The temperature in the control room has climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The batteries are dying, plunging the compartments into a dim, hellish twilight. Communication with Moscow is gone, severed. They are alone, blind, and hunted. In this cauldron of paranoia and exhaustion, Captain Valentin Savitsky's composure has finally fractured. He sees only aggression, the opening salvo of a war he believes has already begun. But another man, soaked in the same sweat, breathing the same poisoned air, has not surrendered his reason. Vasily Arkhipov, chief of staff for the entire submarine flotilla, moves through the suffocating confines of the control room. His eyes, accustomed to the vastness of the ocean, now scan the cramped space, taking in the terror etched on the young sailors' faces, the frantic energy in the forward torpedo room visible through an open hatch, and the desperate resolve hardening the captain's features. He understands the precipice they are standing on. "Captain, report." Arkhipov's voice is steady, cutting through the low hum of failing equipment. Savitsky turns, his face slick with perspiration. Theirs is a complicated hierarchy. Savitsky is the absolute master of this vessel, yet Arkhipov, the Commodore, outranks him within the flotilla's command structure. In peacetime, it is a source of potential friction. Here, in the abyss, on the brink of apocalypse, it has become an accidental and essential check on absolute power. "Commodore." Savitsky's voice is strained, brittle. "The Americans have been prosecuting us with these explosives for 4 hours. We have lost all contact with Fleet Command. Our battery power is critical. The air is becoming unbreathable. I have concluded that war has begun. We must strike before B-59 is destroyed." He pauses, letting the weight of his next words settle. "I have ordered the special weapon prepared for launch." The declaration hangs in the superheated atmosphere. seeming to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. The special weapon. A single torpedo tipped with a nuclear warhead, carrying the same destructive force as the bomb that had leveled Hiroshima. Around them, crew members, frozen at their stations, listen to an exchange that will determine not only whether they live or die, but whether the world itself continues or burns. Archipov's response is measured, a deliberate counterweight to the captain's panic. "Captain, those are practice depth charges. They are not designed to breach the hull. The Americans are trying to force us to surface, not destroy us. If they wanted to sink this submarine, we would already be at the bottom of the ocean." "We cannot know their intentions," Savitsky snaps, his voice rising with a torrent of frustration and fear. "We have no communications, no intelligence, no orders. We are compelled to assume the worst and act accordingly." Arkhipov steps closer, his gaze unwavering. "If we launch," he says, his voice low but resonant, "the Americans will retaliate with nuclear weapons. B-59 will be destroyed. The Soviet fleet will be destroyed. This action will trigger a full strategic exchange." He traces the path of Armageddon with his words. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, all gone. New York, Washington, London, all gone. Hundreds of millions of human beings dead in the first hours. Savitsky's face twists, a mask of anger and desperation. "Then we are already dead men. If war has started, if the Americans are attacking us, we have a sacred duty to strike back with everything we have." "We do not know that war has started," Arkhipov insists, his calmness a defiant act in this hellish theater. "We have lost communications. That is the only fact we possess. The Americans are harassing us, yes, but they are not attacking with lethal force. If we surface, we can re-establish contact. We can learn what is actually happening before we make a decision that can never be undone." Watching this confrontation is the submarine's political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. He had already given his consent to the captain's order, swayed by the terror of their situation. In theory, the agreement of 2 senior officers should have been sufficient, but Archipov's presence, his unassailable logic, has changed the equation. Maslenikov now finds himself the fulcrum upon which the fate of civilization rests, a terrible and unforeseen weight. He sees the abyss not through the captain's panicked eyes, but through the Commodore's clear, steady gaze. In the crushing silence of the deep, surrounded by unseen enemies and the ghosts of a future they might single-handedly erase, the world held its breath. History is so often written as the story of great armies and powerful leaders making grand pronouncements in sunlit rooms. But perhaps its true course is more often decided in darkness, obstinate courage of a single, rational mind. The steel hull of the Soviet submarine B-59 groans under the immense pressure of the Sargasso Sea. It is October 27, 1962, and deep within this metal coffin, the world is ending. The air is thick, hot, and foul with the stench of sweat and fear. Batteries are failing. The temperature in some compartments has soared past 50 degrees Celsius, and for hours, the percussive blasts of American depth charges have hammered against the hull, a relentless psychological torment. In the cramped control room, Captain Valentin Savitsky stares at his superior officer, his expression a terrible fusion of fury and desperation. The captain's face is a flushed, mottled red from the suffocating heat, the veins at 'neath sweat-slicked skin. He has watched his crew wither, gasping for air that is turning to poison. He has made the hardest decision of his life, a decision to unleash hell from the depths. And now, this man, Vasily Arkhipov, dares to question him. Commodore. Savitsky's voice is raw, strained, slicing through the oppressive air. With all respect, this is my submarine. I am responsible for this crew and this vessel. I have determined that we are under attack and that war has begun. The special weapon is our only means of striking back before we are destroyed. The special weapon. A torpedo tipped with a nuclear warhead, carrying the destructive force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. A weapon intended not to fight a battle, but to begin the final war. Vasily Arkhipov steps closer, moving into the captain's incandescent rage. His own face is pale, beaded with sweat, but his eyes are clear. He lowers his voice, a low, steady anchor against the storm of Savitsky's panic. Valentin Grigorievich, listen to me. You are not thinking clearly. None of us are. The heat, the carbon dioxide, it is affecting our judgment. We must surface. We must establish communications. We must verify the situation before we launch a weapon that will kill millions. Surface? The word is a shard of broken glass in Savitsky's throat. Surface so the Americans can sink us the moment we breach? So they can capture us, interrogate us, parade us as trophies while Moscow burns? To him, surfacing is not an option. It is surrender. It is the ultimate failure. The Americans want us to surface, Arkhipov counters, his logic a stark contrast to the captain's emotion. If they wanted to sink us, they would be using real depth charges, not these practice charges. We would already be dead, Valentin. Think, why would they waste hours trying to force us up if their only intention is to destroy us? It is a signal, not an attack. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, intervenes, attempting to reinforce the chain of command. Commodore, the captain has ordered the weapon prepared. I have concurred. That should be sufficient authorization under our operational orders. Arkhipov turns his gaze to Maslenikov. His voice remains calm, but it is now a sheath of ice over a core of unyielding steel. Commissar, I am the flotilla commander. I outrank both of you. And more importantly, the special authorization protocols for this flotilla require unanimous consent from 3 officers before nuclear weapons can be employed. The captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. 3 votes are required. He pauses, letting the weight of his words settle in the suffocating air. He looks from Maslenikov back to the tormented face of his friend, Captain Savitsky. And I vote no. So the labored wheezing of the failing ventilation systems, and the distant, muffled concussion of another American practice charge detonating above them. A ghostly knock on the door of their tomb. Miles away in the forward torpedo room, the weapons officer has paused the arming sequence. He cannot hear the words, but he can feel the shift. The sudden, terrible stillness that has descended upon the command crew. Throughout the sweating, oxygen-starved compartments of B-59, sailors wait in the crushing heat, their lives hanging on an argument they cannot hear, decided by 3 men at the precipice of oblivion. The tension finally breaks. Savitsky's hand slams down on the navigation here. In that moment, the apocalypse was given an order, and a single human being had the clarity and courage to disobey. History is not always shaped by grand armies crossing borders or treaties signed in ornate halls. Sometimes it is forged in the crushing dark, 1,000 feet beneath the waves, by the quiet fortitude of a single, dissenting voice. Deep beneath the turbulent surface of the Caribbean, the Soviet submarine B-59 was dying. It was October 27, 1962, a day the world would later call Black Saturday. Down in the crushing dark, the crew knew nothing of global politics. They knew only the immediate, suffocating reality of their steel tomb. The air was a toxic cocktail of carbon dioxide and diesel fumes, the temperature inside the control room soaring past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Condensation wept from the bulkheads, mingling with the sweat that drenched every man. They were a ghost ship, cut off from Moscow for days, hunted by an American fleet they could hear but not see. The only communication from the world above came in the form of explosions. Practice depth charges, designed not to rupture the hull, but to rattle the minds of those within. And they were succeeding. With every concussive thump that slammed through the steel, nerves frayed a little more, and the fragile discipline of command began to fracture. Inside the sweltering control room, a confrontation had reached its boiling point. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, his face slick with sweat and his uniform stained, turned on his second-in-command. "This is mutiny. I am the captain of this vessel. I have the authority." His voice was strained, the voice of a man pushed beyond endurance. But the man he faced was not merely a subordinate. He was Vasily Arkhipov, chief of staff for the entire submarine flotilla, and his presence on B-59 was a quirk of fate that would shape the course of history. "You have the authority to command this submarine," Arkhipov interrupted, his own voice rising, cutting through the oppressive heat. "You do not have the authority to start World War III on your own initiative. That requires confirmation, verification, orders from Fleet Command, none of which we have." The two men were locked in a battle of wills, a microcosm of the global standoff playing out thousands of feet above them. For Savitsky, the situation was simple and terrifying. They were under attack. "We have no communications," Savitsky shouted, all pretense of military decorum gone. "Moscow is silent. That silence tells us everything we need to know." To the beleaguered captain, the absence of a signal was the signal itself. A scream from a homeland that might already be a radioactive wasteland. Arkhipov remained the anchor of reason in a sea of escalating panic. "That silence tells us only that we are out of communication range," he insisted, his tone firm. "Nothing more. You are making assumptions based on incomplete information, while your judgment is compromised by heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation." Watching this terrifying exchange was the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. His role was to ensure ideological compliance, to bolster morale with party doctrine. But no manual, no lecture in Marxism-Leninism had prepared him for this. Two of the Soviet Navy's most senior officers were arguing over the launch of a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, a weapon with the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The launch protocol required the unanimous consent of all three men. One vote would determine the outcome. His vote. Maslenikov chose his words with the care of a man defusing a bomb. "Commodore," he said, addressing Arkhipov, "what do you propose?" Arkhipov's plan was simple, logical, and fraught with its own danger. "We surface. We establish communications. We verify the situation. If war has actually started, if Moscow confirms we are under attack, then we can make an informed decision about whether to use the special weapon. But we do not launch based on assumption and fear." As if on cue, another depth charge detonated, this one closer, more violent. The entire submarine shuddered, the hull groaning under the pressure wave. Lights flickered. In the control room, several young crew members flinched, their eyes wide with terror. The explosions were no longer just a signal to surface. They had become a form of psychological warfare, a relentless hammer chipping away at resolve, breeding paranoia, and driving men toward the precipice of desperate decisions. Savitsky seized on the moment, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "You hear that? They are trying to kill us. Every minute we wait, we grow weaker. The batteries are nearly dead. The air is poison. Soon we will be unable to maneuver, unable to defend ourselves. If we surface now, we are helpless. If we strike first, we at least take some of them with us." It was the logic of a cornered animal, a final, defiant act against an unseen enemy. Arkipov's voice was low, but it carried an immense weight, the weight of a man who understood the true stakes. "If we strike first," he countered, "we guarantee our destruction and the destruction of everything we are sworn to protect. The Soviet Union, our families, our cities. Everything dies if we launch that weapon." The argument had reached its terrible impasse. Two futures hung in the balance, suspended in the foul, recycled air of the control room. One, championed by Savitsky, was born of the belief that the end had already begun and that honor demanded a final, cataclysmic response. The other, held by Arkhipov, was a plea for one last shred of reason, a gamble on the hope that the world above was not yet lost. All eyes turned to Ivan Maslenikov. The political officer was a true believer, a man trained his entire life to support the captain's authority, to enforce the discipline of the party. But he was also a man intelligent enough to recognize the abyss that was opening before them. He saw the wildness in his captain's eyes, a product of heat and fear. He heard the terrifying, unshakable logic in Arkipov's words. His choice was not merely between two officers, it was between two worlds. One of fire and ash, and another that might, just might, still have a dawn waiting for it. In that submerged crucible, far from any seat of power, history held its breath. It would not be decided by presidents or premiers, but by the conscience of a single man, tasked with a vote that could preserve the world or end it. In the crushing depths of the Sargasso Sea, a voice of reason cuts through the poisoned air. Commodore Kipov's logic, stark and unwelcome, hangs in the suffocating heat of the control room. The Americans, he insists, are using practice charges. They are signaling, not attacking. They are rattling the cage, not destroying it. A communications blackout, he argues, is not definitive proof of apocalypse. In this steel tomb, plunged into a silent, isolated world, the absence of a signal could mean anything. The crippling heat, the carbon dioxide building to toxic levels, it is a poison seeping into the very fabric of reason, warping the judgment of every man aboard, from the lowest rating to the captain himself. At 17:25 hours, after a passage of time that has stretched into an eternity, but measures only 13 minutes on the chronometer, the moment arrives. 13 minutes since Captain Savitsky, his face a mask of grim resolve, ordered the special weapon prepared. Now, Vadim Maslenikov, the second in command, makes his decision. Commodore Kipov is correct. The words land with the finality of a judge's gavel. We must surface. We must re-establish contact before an irreversible line is crossed. For Captain Savitsky, the descent is a physical blow, a betrayal of command in the crucible of combat. His own second has sided with the flotilla commodore. The vote is 2 against 1. The chain of command, the very protocol for unleashing Armageddon, has been broken by a simple, terrifying majority. The nuclear torpedo will not be fired. For a long, breathless moment, the control room is balanced on a razor's edge. Savitsky's face contorts, a canvas of disbelief, rage, and profound frustration. His fists clench into white-knuckled knots of stone. Here is a man pushed beyond the known limits of human endurance, a commander whose authority has been dismantled before his eyes. Men in such conditions are ghosts of themselves, capable of anything. But the years of discipline, a lifetime forged in the rigid hierarchy of the Soviet Navy, hold him fast. He is, above all, a professional officer. The vote has been taken. The decision is made. He will comply. Very well, Savitsky says. The voice that emerges is not his own. It is a hollow, brittle thing, stripped of all authority, heavy with defeat and exhaustion. We surface. The order ripples through the claustrophobic corridors of the B-59, a wave of palpable, unspoken relief. In the forward torpedo room, the weapons officer moves with practiced, deliberate hands. The special weapon, the 10-kiloton device that held the world's fate in its warhead, is secured. Its safety interlocks are re-engaged. It is returned to its cradle, a sleeping monster once more. Throughout the submarine, men allow themselves a breath they did not realize they were holding, a shallow intake of the foul, recycled air. They are going to surface. They are going to live, at least for now. The emergency procedure begins with a violent roar. Compressed air, screaming from its flasks, blows the seawater from the ballast tanks, a sound that tears through the ocean's silence. Aboard the American destroyer USS Beale, patrolling directly overhead, sonar operators flinch at their consoles. "Sir, contact is surfacing. Emergency ascent!" The American captain, unaware of the drama that has just unfolded in the depths, orders his crew to battle stations. This is an anomaly. Soviet submarines have been shadowed for days, but none have broken the surface. This could be a surrender. It could be a prelude to a surface engagement, a desperate fight with deck guns. Or it could be a simple malfunction, a wounded whale forced to breach. What the men on the USS Beale do not know, what they can never know, is that they are not hunters observing their prey. They are children who have been throwing stones at a sleeping dragon. The practiced depth charges, their routine tools of anti-submarine harassment, had nearly become the trigger for the very war they were meant to prevent. At 17:34 hours, the sail of the B-59 cleaves the surface of the Atlantic. Water cascades down its black, scarred hull as compressed air continues to vent, a final, gasping exhalation. There, surrounded by the might of the American fleet, the Soviet submarine lies exposed under the open sky, a testament not to military might or technological prowess, but to the fragile, fraught power of human restraint. The fate of millions had not been decided in the halls of power, but by the strained conscience of 3 men, suffocating in a steel box deep beneath the waves. The tropical sun beats down without mercy, turning the deck of the surfaced submarine into a scorching plate of steel. For the men of the Soviet submarine B-59, hunted for hours in the suffocating pressure cooker they had endured while submerged, yet it carries the promise of life. Captain Valentin Savitsky gives the order. A tortured groan of metal echoes as the bridge hatch is forced open. Air, hot, humid, thick with the scent of salt and diesel, floods the vessel's interior. It is not fresh, but it is breathable. It is oxygen. Men, their lungs burning from an atmosphere thick with carbon dioxide, gasp and gulp it down in desperate torrents. For some, the relief is too much. They break down, tears of deliverance tracing paths through the grime on their faces. The temperature inside the submarine's hull still hovers at a debilitating 122 degrees Fahrenheit, but the invisible poison that had clouded their minds and pushed them to the edge of oblivion is finally dissipating. On the bridge, Savitsky raises his binoculars. The world that greets him is one of pure, unadulterated menace. 3 American destroyers, gray sentinels of a global superpower, form a perfect triangle around his crippled vessel. They hold their position at a distance of approximately 2,000 yards, close enough for their crews to be seen, close enough for their intent to be unmistakable. On the horizon, the silhouettes of more ships are visible, elements of the massive United States Navy task force enforcing the quarantine of Cuba. The American warships are at battle stations, their guns trained directly on the exposed, vulnerable Soviet submarine. From the bridge of the USS Beale, a signal lamp begins to flash, a blinking, insistent eye cutting through the haze. The message is brutally simple, stripped of all diplomatic pleasantry. Identify yourself. State your intentions. Savitsky does not respond. A storm of emotion rages within him. The exhaustion of a commander who has not slept, the profound humiliation of being for the Soviet fleet is now a crippled beast, its electrical heart nearly still. His crew is debilitated. He has no operational capability. And burning deeper than all of it is the sting of his authority being challenged, his ultimate judgment to unleash a nuclear torpedo overruled by his flotilla chief of staff, Vasily Arkhipov. But somewhere beneath the anger, a terrible and chilling understanding begins to form. It seeps into tacking. They are waiting. They are not raining shells upon his deck. They are asking questions. If the war he had believed was already raging overhead had truly begun, B-59 would have been blasted into scrap metal the instant it breached the waves. Instead, they maintain their distance. They seek communication. They desire de-escalation. Arkhipov was right. The realization offers no comfort. It is a ghastly revelation that plunges Savitsky into a new kind of hell. He had nearly given the order. He had nearly launched a weapon of unimaginable power based on a mistaken assumption, his perception warped by the phantom explosions of practiced depth charges he believed were real. He had nearly ignited the Third World War because the suffocating heat and the poison of his own breath had stripped him of clear thought. He had nearly condemned millions to a fiery death because his pride, the stubborn pride of a cornered commander, had refused to yield to an officer whose head remained clear. The signal lamp on the USS Beale continues its patient, damning question. Identify yourself. State your intentions. The fury is gone, replaced by the immense, crushing weight of what almost was. Savitsky lowers his binoculars and turns to his signalman. He gives the order to respond. Soviet submarine B-59. Diesel-electric power depleted. Requesting permission to recharge batteries and depart area. The reply from the American destroyer comes quickly. A professional, almost anticlimactic flash of light across the water. Permission granted. Maintain current position. Do not submerge. United States Navy vessels will maintain observation. And so the crisis ends. Not with the incandescent fire of a nuclear warhead vaporizing an American fleet. Not with B-59 plunging to the abyss under a barrage of high explosives. It ends with a quiet exchange of signals under the Caribbean sun, with a Soviet captain swallowing his pride and acknowledging that his judgment had been fatally compromised by the very air he breathed. The fate of the world, in that moment, did not hinge on ideologies or arsenals. but on the strained humanity of exhausted men and the quiet voice of reason that prevailed against the roaring instinct for war. Beneath an unforgiving Atlantic sky, the wounded Leviathan B-59 breaks the surface, its dark hull slick with brine. For 6 agonizing hours, its diesel engines roar to life, a desperate gasp for power to recharge its depleted batteries. The American destroyers, the hunters that had pushed it to the brink, now keep a respectful, watchful distance. They have cornered their quarry, but the nature of the beast they trapped remains a terrifying unknown. Inside the submarine's claustrophobic confines, a miracle begins to unfold. The air conditioning system, silenced during the suffocating pursuit, sputters back into operation. A merciful chill slowly bleeds into the superheated compartments, pushing back against the oppressive 100-degree-plus temperatures. The metallic taste of carbon dioxide, which had brought men to the edge of unconsciousness, begins to recede. Crew members, slumped at their stations on the verge of heat stroke, slowly revive, their chests rising and falling with cleaner, cooler air. Food and water are finally distributed, for some, the first sustenance to pass their lips in over 12 excruciating hours. Then, at 23:40 hours on the evening of October 27th, a crackle from the radio room cuts through the exhaustion. A message, transmitted from the distant security of the Soviet Northern Fleet headquarters. It is brutally brief, stripped of all pleasantry. Return to base immediately. Avoid further contact with United States Navy forces. Report all details of the incident upon arrival. The words, carried across thousands of miles of ocean, are more than just an order. They are a vindication. They are the objective proof that Vasily Arkhipov had been right. War had not begun. The cities of the world were not burning. The crisis, a planetary fever that had held humanity in its grip, continued its dangerous course. Soviet and American forces still shadowed one another around the island of Cuba, still tested the limits of brinkmanship, still walked the razor's edge between peace and annihilation. But the final, irrevocable line had not been crossed. The apocalypse had been postponed. On October 28th, B-59 commences the long, solemn journey home. It travels on the surface, a ghost ship limping northward, conserving what little power it has, desperate to avoid another confrontation. It is a defeated vessel, its crew having survived not only the relentless American pursuit, but the far more intimate threat of their own captain's desperation. A venomous silence settles between Captain Savitsky and Flotilla Commander Arkhipov. The professional bond, the very chain of command, has been irreparably fractured in the depths. Savitsky knows, on a cold intellectual level, that Arkhipov's descent saved them all. He saved the crew. He saved the mission from catastrophic failure. He saved the Soviet Union from initiating a war it could not win. He saved the world. But the captain's pride is a wound that will not heal. He cannot forgive the profound humiliation of being overruled in his own command center, the shame of his judgment being so starkly questioned, the bitter defeat of being forced. Arkhipov, for his part, seeks no gratitude. He does not see himself as a savior. In his mind, he simply performed his duty. He made a calculated decision in a moment of extreme duress, nothing more. The fact that this decision averted nuclear war was merely a consequence of sound reasoning. Any rational officer, he believed, faced with the same ambiguous evidence, would have reached the same conclusion. The Americans were dropping practice charges, not depth charges. Communications were down, but an absence of information was not proof of Armageddon. To surface and verify the situation was the only logical, the only sane course of action. Yet, as the submarine plows through the cold Atlantic swells, A chilling understanding begins to haunt Arkhipov, a truth that will shadow him for the rest of his life. He understands the terrifying fragility of that moment. He replays the scene, but removes himself from the equation. If he had not been aboard B-59, if the command structure had been the standard arrangement, if the final, world-altering decision had rested with only 2 men instead of 3, the launch key would have turned. Savitsky and the political officer, Maslenikov, would have authorized the firing of the nuclear torpedo. A flash of atomic fire would have vaporized an American destroyer, turning steel and men into a column of radioactive steam. And from that moment, the carefully constructed logic of deterrence would have collapsed into the terrible, simple calculus of retaliation. The United States would have answered not with a single weapon, but with the overwhelming, world-ending force of its entire arsenal. History, in that sweltering control room, did not turn on the strength of armies or the will of presidents, but on the quiet, reasoned voice of a single man who refused to believe the world had already ended. In the frigid darkness of the Kola Peninsula, a ghost slips into port. It is the 15th of November, 1962. 19 days after the world held its breath, the Soviet submarine B-59 arrives home, not to a hero's welcome, but to a shroud of enforced silence. Under strict orders of absolute secrecy, it ties up to the pier, its scarred hull a testament to a confrontation the world was never meant to know. There is no press coverage, no official acknowledgement. The crew, gaunt and exhausted, are not sent to their families, but are immediately sequestered, swallowed by the maw of Soviet naval intelligence. Their debriefing is not a formality. It is an inquisition. For weeks, in sterile, windowless rooms, every officer, every crew member is interrogated. They are separated, their stories cross-referenced, their memories mined for any inconsistency. The questions are relentless, surgical. What were the conditions inside that steel coffin, deep in the warm waters of the Caribbean? What was the temperature? How high was the carbon dioxide? What orders were given? And how, precisely, did the command structure function at the moment of crisis? The interrogators circle one event, one terrifying moment on the 27th of October. They demand to know why Captain Valentin Savitsky, convinced he was under attack, ordered the submarine's special weapon, a torpedo tipped with a nuclear warhead, to be prepared for launch. And then, the pivotal question. Why did Commodore Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla commander who happened to be aboard B-59, refuse to give his consent? This command structure is the focus of intense scrutiny. The requirement for unanimous consent from 3 officers was an anomaly, a quirk of fate that placed the fleet commander on that specific vessel. For the Soviet High Command, this was a critical question of doctrine. Did this unique arrangement function as an intended failsafe, or did it create a dangerous, paralyzing delay in combat decision-making? Was Arkhipov a hero, or an insubordinate officer who broke the chain of command at the worst possible moment? For Captain Savitsky, the debriefing is a personal crucible. It is brutal. He is forced to stand alone and explain how he concluded that the Third World War had already begun. His evidence? A complete communications blackout with Moscow, and the percussive, hammering blows of practiced depth charges dropped by American destroyers. Explosions designed to sigil leaved was his duty. He must also concede, under the cold, unblinking stare of his superiors, that his judgment may have been catastrophically impaired by crippling heat exhaustion and the slow, insidious poison of carbon dioxide that had saturated the air inside his submarine. In the end, Savitsky is not court-martialed. His actions, however terrifying in hindsight, were technically within the bounds of his authorization. Soviet naval doctrine explicitly permitted submarine commanders, isolated and cut off from command, to use their nuclear weapons if they determined war had begun. But the incident sends a shockwave through the Admiralty. It lays bare the terrifying questions of judgment under extreme stress and the profound dangers of delegating the power to end the world to individual commanders, operating alone in the abyss. Captain Savitsky's naval career did not end with a bang, but with a whimper. The 27th of October, 1962, was its final, effective day. Though he receives no formal punishment, he is never again given a combat command. He is quietly reassigned to administrative duties, to teaching positions, to shore assignments far from the sea, far from the operational submarines he once commanded. The Soviet Navy has lost its faith in his judgment. But more devastatingly, Savitsky has lost faith in himself. In private moments, for the rest of his life, he replays the incident. The suffocating heat, the deafening concussion of the depth charges against the hull, the absolute, unshakable certainty that war had begun, the burning conviction that using his weapon was not just an option, but an obligation. One man, one vote, one no spoken in a suffocating control room was all that stood between his conviction and a nuclear exchange. It is a chilling testament that the fate of civilization often rests not on grand strategies or political summits, but on the frayed nerves and whispered words of men pushed to the very edge of human endurance, deep beneath the waves. For Captain Valentin Savitsky, the ascent from the abyss was not a reprieve, but the beginning of a private hell. He had been certain. In the suffocating heat and poisoned air of the B-59, with American warships hammering the hull, the conviction had crystallized into a terrible, righteous clarity. The war had begun. The launch of their nuclear torpedo was not only justified, it was a sacred duty. And then, there was the calm, unshakable refusal of Vasily Arkhipov, and the deciding vote that sealed his fate. The moment the submarine breached the waves was a moment of profound humiliation. Blinking in the hostile sunlight, surrounded by the very American ships he had been convinced were waging a world-ending war, the truth descended upon him with crushing force. He had been wrong. Wrong about everything. The explosions were practice charges. The war was a phantom of his own oxygen-starved, heat-addled mind. This knowledge became a cancer on his soul. He, a decorated captain of the Soviet fleet, had come within a single vote of initiating the Third World War. He had nearly unleashed a weapon that would have vaporized thousands in an instant, and condemned millions more in the firestorm of retaliation. The judgment that had defined his career had failed him at the moment of ultimate Koghost. Withdrawn and bitter, haunted by the specter of what he had almost done, he sought refuge in the bottle, a desperate attempt to drown the incessant whispers of a war that never was. He died in 1975, at the age of just 55. His health was not merely ruined by the brutal physical toll of submarine service, but utterly shattered by the unbearable weight of a world he almost unmade. For Vasily Arkhipov, the experience was entirely different. He was not brought back in disgrace, but for interrogation. In the sterile rooms of Soviet naval intelligence, the debriefing was relentless. They circled his decision, probing it from every angle. Why did he conclude that war had not started? What evidence in that chaotic crucible had informed his judgment? Would he, under the same impossible circumstances, make the same decision again? Arkhipov's answers were a fortress of logic, delivered without emotion. The Americans, he explained, were using practice charges, concussive signals, not lethal depth charges designed to breach a hull. The communications blackout, while deeply unsettling, did not constitute definitive proof that Moscow had been silenced by nuclear fire. Crucially, he recognized the environment itself as an enemy. The debilitating heat and rising carbon dioxide were compromising the rational faculties of every man aboard, creating a factory for paranoia, where a mistaken assumption could become a global catastrophe. In such a state, he argued, the only logical course of action was the one that was reversible: to surface, to verify, before taking a step from which humanity could never return. The debriefing officers searched for weakness, for a flicker of fear, for any indication that his refusal was born of cowardice or disloyalty. They found nothing. Archipov's decision was not an act of insubordination, but a masterclass in tactical reason and strategic foresight. It was sound, correct, and had ultimately prevented a catastrophic escalation that would have served no Soviet interest. Deep within the classified archives of the Soviet Naval Command, a chilling conclusion was reached. The three-officer authorization protocol aboard the B-59 had functioned exactly as it was designed. It had been the final firebreak, preventing a rash decision made under extreme duress from igniting the planet. But the incident had also exposed a terrifying vulnerability. It revealed that a loyal and capable commander, operating independently and cut off from command, could easily, and wrongly, conclude that the final war had begun. Under such pressure, the impulse to respond with all available weapons could become overwhelming. The reforms were not announced with fanfare. They were etched quietly into the protocols of the deep. Nuclear weapon authorization procedures were fundamentally revised. The requirements for confirmation before launch were strengthened, adding more layers, more checks, more moments for a single, rational voice to be heard above the din of impending doom. The world never knew it had held its breath that day in the Caribbean. It is a disquieting truth of our age that the fragile peace can hinge not on treaties or technology, but on the clarity of a single mind in a moment of absolute chaos. On the quiet conviction of one individual surrounded by the clamor for war, who possesses the courage to simply say no. In the silent aftermath, within the opaque machinery of the Soviet state, lessons are learned. Command and control structures are quietly reinforced. Communication protocols, the fragile threads connecting the fleet to its submerged, unseen assets, are rewritten to reduce the chance of a submarine ever again losing contact during a moment of supreme crisis. But these changes are specters, implemented without acknowledgement, born from a terror that can never be publicly admitted. The entire incident aboard the submarine B-59 is buried, locked away under the highest classifications of the Soviet government. For Vasily Arkhipov, the man at the epicenter, there is no fanfare. No hero of the Soviet Union medal is pinned to his chest for preventing the Third World War. There is no public recognition, no official whisper that his single, dissenting vote stayed the hand of nuclear Armageddon. The ironclad secrecy protocols of the Soviet system prohibit any discussion of incidents involving nuclear weapons, regardless of their outcome. Averted catastrophe is as unspeakable as actual disaster. Arkhipov is simply reassigned. His service aboard the B-59 becomes just another classified file, gathering dust in the vast, silent archives of the state. Throughout his lifetime, he never speaks of what happened on the 27th of October. The system that he serves does not permit such candor. When friends or family, perhaps over a glass of tea, would inquire about his time during the Caribbean crisis, Arkhipov would deflect. He offered only vague generalities, tales of routine patrol operations, of frustrating mechanical difficulties. The monumental truth, that he had stared into the abyss and refused to blink, that his single "niet," spoken in a suffocating, sweltering control room, had saved civilization, remained his private burden, locked behind impenetrable barriers of state security. He continues his ascent through the ranks, a career defined by duty and discipline, eventually reaching the esteemed position of Vice Admiral. In the 1980s, he retires from the Soviet Navy, settling into a quiet life with his wife Olga in a modest apartment. He is, to all outward appearances, just another career naval officer, enjoying a peaceful, well-earned retirement. He passes away on the 19th of August, 1998, at the age of 72, a victim of kidney cancer. His obituary, printed in the Russian newspapers, dutifully recounts his distinguished naval service, listing commands and commendations. But there is no reference to the B-59. No mention of that fateful day in 1962. The world does not know the name Vasily Arkhipov. The world has no idea what he prevented. For decades, the story remains one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War, a ghost in the machine of history. The first faint whispers of the truth only begin to emerge in the late 1990s, after the colossal collapse of the Soviet Union. As the iron grip of the state loosens, the doors to its vast military archives begin to creak open, initiating a slow, painstaking process of declassification. Former Soviet naval officers, men once bound by oaths of absolute silence, find their voices. The moment of revelation arrives in 2002. At a conference in Havana, convened to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, several surviving participants from the B-59 take the stage. Before an astonished audience of historians and analysts, they publicly recount, for the first time, exactly what transpired deep beneath the waves on the 27th of October, 1962. The testimony is a bombshell. It lands with the force of a historical earthquake, shattering long-held assumptions. Scholars who had dedicated their entire careers to studying the crisis, who had parsed every telegram and analyzed every presidential recording, are suddenly confronted with a terrifying new reality. They learn of an incident that brought the world closer to nuclear annihilation than any other single moment of the 13-day confrontation. It was not the missile deployments in Cuba, not the tense naval blockade, not the high-stakes diplomatic brinkmanship between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The true fulcrum of fate, the point where history balanced on a razor's edge, was a Soviet submarine captain, his judgment clouded by carbon dioxide and 122-degree heat, on the verge of launching a nuclear torpedo. A man pushed to the very limits of human endurance, stopped only by the calm, steady resolve of a single, forgotten officer. History, it turns out, is not always made in the gilded halls of power. Sometimes it is forged in darkness and crushing pressure, by nameless individuals whose choices remain unknown. Their courage, their restraint, their humanity can shape the destiny of millions, yet leave no trace in the official record. A silent, invisible hand guiding the world away from the precipice. Above the crushing dark of the Caribbean, charges detonated. They were practice rounds, designed to signal, not to destroy. But in the suffocating confines of the Soviet submarine B-59, the distinction was lost. To the men trapped in the failing, overheated vessel, this was an attack. This was the beginning of the end. The lesson from this terrifying moment, as summarized by Thomas Blanton of the National Security Archive, is that a man named Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. This statement is not hyperbole. It is the cold, historical truth. Had Arkhipov not been aboard submarine B-59, had the command structure required only 2 senior officers to authorize the use of a nuclear weapon, the world we know would have ceased to exist. The torpedo, armed with a warhead as powerful as the one that incinerated Hiroshima, would have been launched. An American destroyer would have been instantly vaporized. The United States, believing itself under nuclear attack, would have responded with overwhelming, unimaginable force. The Soviet Union would have retaliated in kind. A full-scale strategic nuclear war. Years later, as classified documents were painstakingly unearthed from Cold War archives, researchers discovered a detail that deepened the horror. B-59 was not an anomaly. It was not the only vessel in Cuban waters carrying a weapon of last resort. The submarines B-4 and B-36, also part of the Soviet flotilla, carried the same special weapons. All three commanders had been given the same terrifying authorization. If they determined that war had begun and they were cut off from Moscow, they had the authority to launch. The same nightmarish conditions that nearly drove Captain Savitsky of the B-59 to unleash apocalypse could have easily afflicted the other commanders. Inside the steel hulls, temperatures soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These were diesel-electric boats, built for the icy waters of the Arctic, now dying in the tropical heat. Air conditioning systems failed. The carbon dioxide scrubbers were overwhelmed. The air grew thick, metallic, saturated with poison. Every man's breath was a labor, their lungs burning with stale, recycled air. And through this haze of heat and exhaustion came the concussions of American depth charges, a relentless harassment that frayed every nerve. They were blind, deaf, and utterly alone, a communications blackout severing their last link to reality. The world came within minutes of nuclear war, not once, but potentially 3 separate times. 3 submarine commanders, 3 nuclear-armed torpedoes, 3 isolated, agonizing decisions about whether the world above had already ended. The fact that none of them fired is less a testament to sound judgment and more a profound accident of personality and protocol. Modern analysis of the B-59 incident reveals a cascade of systemic failures. The Soviet submarines were deployed with a staggering lack of foresight. Their operational challenges were fatally underestimated. Communication protocols were entirely inadequate for vessels operating independently at such an extreme range. Most damningly, nuclear weapon authorization procedures delegated an apocalyptic decision to individual commanders, placing the fate of the planet in the hands of men subjected to conditions guaranteed to impair their judgment. But the American side was equally culpable, operating under its own veil of ignorance. The United States Navy's anti-submarine warfare forces had no idea that the submarines they were aggressively hunting carried nuclear weapons. The practiced depth charges, intended as a non-lethal form of harassment to force the submarines to surface, were indistinguishable from an actual attack to the crews trapped below. The aggressive pursuit of these Soviet vessels brought American warships within range of weapons that could have obliterated entire task forces in a single, blinding flash. 2 superpowers, poised at the zenith of their power, were operating blind. Each side was making assumptions, taking risks that neither fully understood. Humanity was not spared by wisdom or strategic genius, but by a flaw in a protocol, by the fortuitous presence of a single, steady hand in the heart of a storm. It serves as a chilling reminder that the line between our world and oblivion is not a fortress wall, but a thread, held in the dark by men we will never know. Deep beneath the waves of the Sargasso Sea, history held its breath. The date was October 27, 1962. The world above teetered on the precipice of annihilation, but the true fulcrum of fate was here, sealed inside the suffocating steel hull of the Soviet submarine B-59. This was not a place of rational decision-making. It was a pressure cooker, an incubator for catastrophe. For days the crew had been hunted, trapped below the surface by a ring of American warships. The air conditioning had failed. Temperatures inside the submarine soared past 100 degrees, the metal walls sweating with a feverish condensation. The air itself had become a toxic soup, thin on oxygen, thick with the carbon dioxide of every panicked exhalation. And then came the sound. The percussive, bone-jarring thunder of practiced depth charges, dropped by the destroyers above. For 4 agonizing hours, the explosions hammered against the hull, each concussion a violent reminder of their isolation, their vulnerability. Cut off from Moscow, with communications severed, the men of B-59 were alone in the dark. In the mind of the submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, these explosions were not practice. They were the opening salvos of the Third World War. He was a competent commander, a man with years of experience etched into his face. But the environment had become a poison, seeping into the very process of thought. Heat exhaustion, oxygen deprivation, the unrelenting psychological battery of the depth charges. It was a perfect storm designed to shipwreck human judgment. He became certain of things that were not true. He was convinced that his submarine was doomed, that his homeland was under attack, and that his final, terrible duty was to retaliate. He gave the order to prepare the submarine's most formidable weapon, a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, a device with the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The decision to cross the threshold from conventional conflict to a nuclear apocalypse, a choice that could not be undone, was not to be made in the White House or the Kremlin. It was to be made here, by men whose minds were being starved of air and reason. This is the nightmare scenario that haunted the architects of the atomic age. Not a war started by malice or grand strategy, but one sparked by accident, by miscalculation. A war born from good people, pushed beyond their limits, making the worst possible decision because they lacked a single, clarifying piece of information. To launch the weapon, protocol required the unanimous consent of 3 senior officers. Captain Savitsky was resolute. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, concurred. The world was now balanced on the conviction of a single man, Vasily Arkhipov. As Commodore of the submarine flotilla, his approval was the final, necessary key. He had no special insight, no secret intelligence from on high. He had only the same flawed, incomplete information as the others. He was breathing the same toxic air, enduring the same terrifying bombardment. Yet, in that sweltering control room, surrounded by the certainty of his comrades, Arkhipov maintained a sliver of doubt. He questioned the core assumption that the war had already begun. He insisted, argued, and demanded that they verify their reality before taking an action that would forever alter it. He exercised the authority his rank afforded him to countermand a decision that would have vaporized an American carrier strike group and triggered a full-scale, civilization-ending nuclear exchange. He did it with a single word. Niet. No. In that moment of supreme crisis, the fate of millions was not decided by presidents or generals reading sanitized reports in sterile command bunkers. It was decided by a Soviet submarine officer, his uniform soaked in sweat, refusing to sanction the end of the world. Olga Arkhipova, his widow, would later reflect on the essence of her husband's character. He was a level-headed person, she said. He knew that it was madness to fire a nuclear torpedo. The Americans would have responded, and it would have led to a catastrophe. A simple assessment for a truth of staggering importance. It was madness, but in the heat and the carbon dioxide and the claustrophobic fear aboard B-59, madness had become the prevailing logic. The line between sanity and apocalypse was not a fortified border, but a fragile membrane, as thin as the air in a dying submarine. The story of B-59 reveals a disquieting truth about the systems we build to protect ourselves. It shows that the survival of our species can ultimately depend not on meticulous planning or rational statecraft, but on the unpredictable resilience of a single human mind in a moment of unbearable pressure. The world did not survive the Cuban Missile Crisis because the system worked. It survived because one man in the right place at the right time refused to let it fail. We owe our existence not to design, but to a profound and terrifying stroke of luck. 200 feet beneath the waves of the Atlantic, the world was ending. Inside the steel hull of the Soviet submarine B-59, the air was thick with carbon dioxide, the temperature soaring past 100 degrees. For days, they had been hunted, cut off from Moscow, battered by American depth charges. Practice rounds, yes, but each explosion rattled the vessel and the nerves of its exhausted crew. On this day, October 27, 1962, Captain Valentin Savitsky, convinced that war had already begun, made a decision. He ordered the submarine's special weapon, a torpedo tipped with a nuclear warhead, to be armed and loaded. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, concurred. 2 votes for apocalypse. 1 vote remained. In that suffocating, pressurized tomb, where madness seemed the only rational response to the chaos outside, one man retained his clarity. Flotilla Commander Vasily Arkhipov looked at the same evidence, felt the same fear, but saw a different truth. He saw not an act of war, but a desperate attempt by the Americans to force them to the surface. He recognized the madness for what it was, and with a single word, refused to participate. The weapon was secured. B-59 surfaced into the light, and civilization, unknowingly, was allowed to continue. This incident is more than a footnote to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is its terrifying, hidden heart. It reveals a truth we still live with decades after the Cold War's end, that the fate of millions can rest not on grand strategy, but on the judgment of individuals under unimaginable duress. Nuclear arsenals remain. Command systems still delegate unimaginable authority to human beings who may face circumstances that cripple reason. The specter of accidental war, triggered not by malice but by miscalculation, by a simple misunderstanding in the fog of conflict, remains terrifyingly real. The story also forces a profound question about the nature of heroism. Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. This is not hyperbole. His descent prevented a nuclear exchange at the most dangerous moment in human history. Yet, he received no medals, no public acknowledgement. He died in obscurity, his name unknown to the very world he preserved. Perhaps this is fitting. True heroism does not seek recognition. Arkhipov did not veto the launch for glory. He did it because it was the correct, logical decision based on the information he had. That this rational process happened to prevent the Third World War was a consequence of his character, not his ambition. But the world should know his name. Students of history should learn not only of Kennedy and Khrushchev, the titans on the world stage, but of the quiet man in the deep, the man who said no when yes would have been so much easier. He was the anchor of reason in a sea of fear, the man who prevented Armageddon with a single vote, cast in the dark, far from the eyes of history.